All right, good morning. My name is Dr. Heather McCrae. I'm a professor here in the history department. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Amy Laurel Fluker, a 2008 graduate of Westminster College. Her passion for history has led her far from home, a life that many academics know all too well. She came to Westminster after growing up in Jefferson City, already knowing that she loved history, but not yet sure where it would take her. After her 4 years here at Westminster, her history path led her to graduate work in Mississippi, where she earned both her master's and PhD. And finally to Youngstown State University in Ohio, where she is the Robert W. Reeder Professor of 19th Century American History. Her work focuses on the Civil War and the role that memory plays in our understanding of that war. This work and her Missouri roots came together in her recent book, Commonwealth of Compromise, Civil War Commemoration in Missouri, published in 2020 by the University of Missouri Press. Today, she will be giving a talk entitled Disrupting the Narrative, Why Civil War History Matters. For those attending on Zoom, please put any questions that you have into the chat. And please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Amy Fluker. Thank you, Dr. McCrae. I want to begin also by thanking Dr. Perry for inviting me to participate in this symposium. It's an absolute joy to be back at Westminster and really bizarre to be here. Last time I was here, I was taking Latin American history with Dr. Laurel in this room. But it was very special to me that the invitation came from Dr. Perry. I had many wonderful professors in my time here at Westminster, including Dr. Goodfellow and Dr. Laurel and Dr. Steelinger. But Dr. Perry had particularly kind words and encouragement for me as I was going through my senior thesis project, which she read out of no obligation, only interest and a willingness to support my work. So I've always remembered that, always appreciated that. And so thank you, Dr. Perry, for inviting me. Today, I wanted to talk to you about why history, particularly the history of the American Civil War, matters. And speaking as an academic, learning how to explain why your work matters is one of the most important things you can do, because students and parents and administrators all want to know, why should we invest time and trouble in the study of history? What kind of career will this lead to? Well, my dissertation advisor, Dr. John Neff, always used to call this the great so what question. So you love Civil War history. So what? Why does it matter? Well, in the case of the American Civil War, I think the great so what question is generally pretty easy to answer, because this conflict continues to be important to people for a variety of reasons. So before we talk about some of those reasons, though, I generally like to do a little primer, a brief little brush up on Civil War history, if you guys don't mind helping me out. So what do we remember about the Civil War? Is anybody willing to just tell me some of the basic nuts and bolts of the history here? When did this conflict happen? Yeah, go for it.
I want to say a little after the Declaration.
Okay, so yeah, almost 100 years after, which I think is really interesting. So 1861 is the start of the conflict. Does anybody remember who the two opposing sides are? Stephen.
You have the North, which is called the Union, and the South, which was the Confederacy.
Okay, so we've got the United States and the Confederate States of America opposing one another in this conflict. And what was the outcome of this war? Who was successful? The United States, right? So the United States are the winners of this conflict. Now, what do we remember about the period of history that follows the Civil War, Reconstruction? Does anybody remember some of the most important aspects of Reconstruction?
So the South was under military occupation during the time, and Reconstruction was also. It's said that while the North won the Civil War, the South won Reconstruction.
Okay, so yeah, this is a really important point, and it gets to the heart of what we want to talk about today, right? It's this sort of general and cliched expression that winners write the history. That seems to be the furthest thing from the truth in the case of the American Civil War. Reconstruction ends, and we'll get into this in a little bit, with a retreat in some ways from the war aims of the United States, a failure to commit to measures that would ensure equality and justice particularly for newly freed African Americans. Okay, so we'll get into some more of the details, but I always like to do a little refresher. So these are the bare bones of the Civil War. So why is this conflict still so important to people? Well, the first and foremost reason, I think, and I like to point this out to my students because it seems very remote, but the American Civil War really wasn't that long ago in the scheme of things. Anecdotally, my grandfather passed away in 2019, but he remembered his great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War, and he knew people who had been born enslaved. So until very recently, even within my family, there were people who had living memory of the Civil War. So it's just not that long ago. Also, the American Civil War was a tragedy of epic proportions. It is, without any reservation, the greatest crisis in United States history, and still the most destructive and deadliest conflict in our history. The Civil War is traumatic, and that trauma has resonated and it continues to impact people. Historians have sort of recently recalculated the death toll of the American Civil War and placed that death toll at around 851,000 soldier deaths. So that number does not account for civilians. And we think there may have been as many as 50,000 who died in the war. That number also does not account well for African Americans and not at all for the enslaved. So the reality is the death toll of this conflict is astronomical and higher than we'll ever really understand. That number, 851,000 dead, is an equivalent proportion of our population today. That's about 8 million lives lost. So again, the most destructive, the most deadly conflict in our history. And we have to take the trauma of that death seriously because Civil War era Americans, white and black, Union and Confederate, are driven to give the Civil War meaning because of that loss, how to make those deaths matter. And the reality is that's a lot easier for some groups of Americans to do than for others, and we'll talk about that. Another reason that the Civil War history matters is that the Civil War was a watershed moment in the development of our nation between what was and what is. And historians have pointed out a variety of ways in which we very much live in the world that the Civil War created, in terms of things like developments in technology, industry, medicine, science, the relationship between citizens and the state. Again, we very much live in the nation that the Civil War created. Most importantly, however, the Civil War exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of a republic dedicated to liberty, equality, and self-determination. That, of course, was racial slavery. The United States entered the war as a society with slaves and emerged from the war embracing this new birth of freedom, as Abraham Lincoln put it, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But while the Civil War resulted in the emancipation of 4 million enslaved Americans, it left larger questions about racial equality unresolved. And this is what, our theme for this symposium, 2020, right? This year of disruptions. This is really what's getting to the heart of sort of the issue here. The connections between slavery, the Civil War, and these unresolved matters of racial justice. This is at the heart of what the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to the forefront of our national consciousness in this moment. So for these reasons and for many others, Civil War history matters to people. Americans care very passionately about this history. Americans are passionate consumers of Civil War history. Civil War historians like to point out that statistically, there's been a book written about the conflict every day since it ended. So it's a vast field. It includes lots of academics and buffs alike. Lots of people believe lots of things about this conflict. And that's what makes Civil War history a little tricky. One of the things that separates the discipline of history, as our students here will understand, One of the things that separates the discipline of history from, say, just the pursuit or the enjoyment of history is that historians don't only study content, right? So there are facts and dates and generals and battles that you'll have to know because they lend important context. But historians also study the history of history. They study how history is written. They study in order to understand how the ways in which the types of sources that historians use, the methodologies they employ, even how their personal, political, and educational backgrounds shape the narratives they write. So historians are trained to recognize that history is far from objective. And this is certainly the case in Civil War history. Civil War history is often very divisive, just because the Civil War had this definitive outcome. The United States won, slavery was abolished, 4 million enslaved people were freed. That doesn't mean Americans have come to any agreement over its causes and consequences in the last 160 years. As I said, people believe a lot of things about the war, and sometimes those beliefs are substantiated by the historical record, and sometimes they aren't. I'll just point at you. Historian Alan Nolan pointed this out. So I wanted to share with you a quote from his book, Lee Considered, which he published in 1991. Nolan said, "Fiction in the form of misinterpretation or the form of outright misrepresentation is endemic to the study of the history of the Civil War. Touching on almost all aspects of the struggle, these fictions have ousted the facts and gained wide currency so that what is treated as the history of the Civil War is instead a legend." And I think this last part is really the key point. Fiction and legend do not replace truth by chance. Instead, they are responses to circumstances and needs. This is at the heart of what I want us to explore today. The difference between history and memory and the consequences of that for us today. Oh, there we go. So what brings us here today? In 2020, we witnessed a dramatic clash over Civil War history. Not really since Reconstruction have debates over the Civil War proven, I think, to be so dramatic and so deadly. This really started in 2015 with the murders of 9 members of the African-American Emmanuel AME congregation in Charleston, South Carolina. This, of course, escalated in 2017 at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and culminating in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the spring of 2020. So gathering momentum from these events, the Black Lives Matter movement has called attention to how the history of the Civil War, but really more particularly how the history of the Confederacy has been misinterpreted and misrepresented, in Nolan's words, over the generations. So as a consequence of this activism, Americans now regularly engage in conversations and debates about Civil War memory, which is a little different than history. Civil War memory. And they're particularly concerned about the appropriateness of Confederate memorials. So one of the ways that we can understand why Civil War history matters to people is to study it through an approach of memory, historical memory. Most of us are sort of taught to think of history as objective. Things either happened or they didn't. History is accurate or inaccurate. It's a collection of facts, and we can learn those facts through a variety of mediums, visiting archives, museums, attending lectures, visiting historic sites, reading books, watching movies, even visiting monuments. But historians of memory think about these things a little differently. They think of history as a construction. So they study the ways in which these facts get put together. What gets preserved, saved, told, retold, what gets left out, and why. So historians of Civil War memory, like myself, we don't study Civil War battles or campaigns or commanders so much as we study the ways in which Civil War history has been interpreted over time. Historians of memory are interested in literature and songs and stories and movies and textbooks and monuments. And we look at these things in order to understand how Americans have lived with their Civil War history and, again, why it matters to them. Okay. So the thing to remember about memory, history is not written in a vacuum, is what this all amounts to. It is shaped by lots of influences. As the sociologist Maurice Halbach famously put it, the past is a social construction mainly, if not wholly, shaped by the concerns of the present. In other words, people create interpretations of the past to suit their needs. They create interpretations of the past that are meaningful to them in their present lives. So the key takeaway from all this is that people make history serve purposes. The way we tell history has the ability to justify or to vindicate, to instill pride, to celebrate, to memorialize, or also to foment hate. History, or rather the interpretations we build around it, it has the power to bind us together. It also has the ability to drive us apart. Oftentimes, the things that we believe about the past separate us into us and them. We believe these things about the past. They believe something different. The Civil War monuments are an excellent way to study how this process unfolds. There's a popular perception out there that monuments are history, that is to say that they're objective history, almost as if the Civil War occurred and then suddenly and spontaneously these monuments sprout out of the ground on campuses and in city centers to testify to this terrible struggle. The human agency behind the construction of these monuments has often been lost. It's important to remember that monuments are constructions. They represent choices, very deliberate choices about what history is being told and preserved. They're put up for a purpose, very meaningful purposes, because they're time-consuming and expensive. The logistics of monument building are pretty intense. Requires organization, planning, fundraising, design, permission, sometimes even legislation, right? These are costly, time-consuming projects, and all of this means that monuments represent the memory of history of the people in power. And we'll return to that idea in a moment. So how has Civil War memory shaped monuments, more particularly Confederate monuments, which we're going to focus on? By studying the monuments that former Confederates built, we can understand the various memories that this group held about the causes and consequences of the Civil War. As vessels of memory, monuments tell us far more about the values and the intentions of the people who built them than they do about the history they supposedly represent. So this is a really useful graph produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center that I think illustrates this point really well. So what you're looking at here is a timeline. I know it's difficult to see. It starts in 1861 and it ends in 2018. And so you're looking at dots that represent different kinds of Confederate memorials. So they're not all monuments. Some of the dots represent school names or street names or things like that. But right, the past is a social construction based on the needs of the present. Monuments tell us about the people who built them, not about the history they represent. And this is a perfect illustration of that. It's no accident, right, that we have this major spike in Confederate commemoration and monument building at the turn of the century, right around 1900, right? There's lots of practical and political reasons for that. This is the point at which the Civil War generation is aging. These people are concerned that their memories of the Civil War are going to die with them. So they want to leave some kind of testament to the rising generation. Practically speaking, it's also a time period in which probably most of them are retired, have leisure time, have some extra money to commit to these kinds of projects. So there's lots of practical reasons for it, but there's also very political reasons. As Stephen pointed out, Reconstruction ends in the redemption, right, of the former Confederate states. So by the time we get to this spike on the chart here, Reconstruction is over. The United States Army has left the South. Former Confederates have returned to political offices and to positions of political and social power in the former Confederacy, and they've imposed racial segregation, Jim Crow laws. Right? So it's no accident, right, that these Confederate monuments, again, really reach a peak here at the turn of the century. So who puts them up and when certainly matters. The next thing that I wanted to sort of explore is how these monuments specifically represent a particular memory of the Civil War, the so-called lost cause memory of the Civil War, which is the version of Civil War history espoused by former Confederates. So there are some key ideas or themes to the lost cause. So I wanted to run through those. I think most historians generally agree on these. This is sort of my own list, but I think it covers the basis fairly well for our purposes today. So the first thing that the lost cause memory of the Civil War insists upon, again, this is a pro-Confederate memory of the Civil War, is that the Civil War is absolutely not about slavery. The Confederacy did not wage a war to preserve slavery. Instead, the war was really about what? I'm sure you guys have heard this before.
States' rights.
States' rights, right? That what the Confederacy wanted was to defend the states' right to self-determination, to set its own internal policies. And that in fighting a war for that purpose, they were honoring the legacy of the American Revolution, defending their interpretation of the Constitution, exercising their right to alter or abolish their government, right? And if slavery was in any way a part of the causes of the war, it was only because those northern radical abolitionists could not let the matter go and drug the country kicking and screaming into the conflict. But again, ultimately, from a Confederate perspective, the lost cause insists this war was not about slavery. Slavery, the lost cause insists, was also benign. It was a benevolent institution that was good for Black people because they are inherently racially inferior. So it was good for them and it was good for the country. And they liked to offer evidence or anecdotes that suggested that loyal slaves supported the Confederate war effort. The lost cause also insists that the Confederacy was not defeated so much as it was overwhelmed by the superior resources of the United States. So lost cause histories are really big on this. They emphasize the lack of advantages that the Confederacy had in terms of manpower and materiel. So they're not so much defeated as they're overwhelmed. They didn't lose the war because they were any less worthy, just it couldn't be won. This next point is very much related to that, right? The loss of the Confederacy does not or should not reflect negatively on the bravery or manhood of Confederate soldiers. They conducted themselves bravely and honorably in the face of impossible odds. And the fact that the war lasted for as long as it did, they argue, is proof of that fact. They're superior soldiers. Again, very much related, the lost cause insists that Confederate leaders, people like Robert E. Lee, uniquely embodied heroism and a very particular kind of Christian piety. They were the best of men. And finally, the lost cause insists that the South universally supported the Confederacy. Again, they'll insist that enslaved people supported the Confederacy, and they'll also insist that women supported the Confederacy, and that considering the lack of advantages that the South had in terms of materiel, that the support of women was crucial to sustaining the Confederate war effort for as long as it lasted. So we could go through this list and talk about things that have kernels of historical truth or things that are very easily debunkable within these claims. But the larger point is just that these are general things that the lost cause memory of the Civil War claims to be true. Okay. And the most important takeaway is that this version of Civil War history is shifting focus away from the moral, political, and ideological issues at the heart of the war to transform it into this honorable, but again, ultimately kind of hopeless fight. Okay. So where does this version of Civil War history come from? It comes from histories of the war, most of them authored in the late 19th century by white Southern men who were either themselves veterans of the war or the children of veterans. Their interpretation of history was extended, bolstered by historians, as well as by major touchstones in popular culture. And so we'll talk about a couple examples of that. And basically these forces, these histories and these aspects of popular culture combine to create this inaccurate version of Confederate history that's gained widespread acceptance and proven pretty hard to displace. So some of the main architects of the lost cause include this guy here, Jubal Early, who was a Confederate general. He served with Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia, and he was devoted to Lee and spent his post-war life doing what he could to vindicate his commanding officer. So he had a personal correspondence with Lee, and Lee would often comment on, particularly this issue of numbers, right? That the reason that he lost battles was because he didn't have the manpower he needed. And so Early would sort of take the things that Lee had told him and write public letters. He writes a memoir. He also established something called the Southern Historical Society that really put this idea out there, again, that the Confederacy wasn't defeated, it was simply overwhelmed. And he really became the arbiter of Confederate history. People would send him, for example, their manuscripts to be vetted and things of that nature. So he was very much a part of the construction of the lost cause. To give you a sense of his attitude, I pulled a quote from a speech that Early gave on Robert E. Lee's birthday in 1872. He said, "Our beloved chief stands like some lofty column which rears its head among the highest in grandeur, simple, pure, and sublime." He said, "The Army of Northern Virginia fought gallantly before, quote, being gradually worn down by the combined agencies of numbers, steam power, railroads, mechanisms, and all the resources of physical science." So again, really advancing that narrative that the Confederacy lost simply because they couldn't win. The other main architect of this lost cause memory of the Civil War is this character, Edward Pollard, who was a journalist, and he wrote a history of the Confederacy called The Lost Cause in 1867. So this is where that name comes from. Pollard makes all kinds of claims about the war, but for our purposes, I think the most important things he says, he advances this idea that the morality of slavery was not an issue in the war, that the war was sparked by Northern jealousy over Southern political domination. He insisted that slavery, quote, did not rest on acts of debasement or disenfranchisement. He also insisted that slavery, quote, established a noble civilization, whereas the North was, quote, coarse and materialistic. So two individuals here who advanced the lost cause. They're not trained historians, but they're writing histories of the war. But as I said, the lost cause also comes from popular culture. And so we have to talk about the 1905 novel by Thomas Dixon called The Klansman. That was adapted into this film, The Birth of a Nation. I'm sure many of you have heard of The Birth of a Nation. It's a notoriously racist film. Its heroes are Confederate soldiers, veterans, and members of the Ku Klux Klan. In the film, Republicans, so the people who would have been advocating for racial equality in the aftermath of the Civil War, they're depicted as cruel and oppressive and power hungry. And again, our heroes are the Klansmen in this story. Black Southerners, particularly Black men, are portrayed as foolish and dangerous. And in one particularly egregious moment in the film, the heroes avenge the death of a young woman who kills herself in order to escape an attempted rape by a Black man. And so the climax of the film is this lynching, essentially, of this Black man. Now, it's important to know, I think, that as powerful as the lost cause was and is, it's never been uncontested. When The Birth of a Nation came out, various communities of Black activists across the country called for bans and boycotts of the film. In some places they were successful, but there were riots and actual violence surrounding the release of the film. At least one Black person was killed by an individual who had seen the movie, came out of the theater and essentially killed the first Black person he encountered because he was so angry at what he saw in The Birth of a Nation. Thomas Dixon, the man who authored the novel this was based on, was very pleased by this. He said that his purpose, quote, was to revolutionize audiences that would transform every man into a Southern partisan for life. So again, this is all happening very deliberately. Early and Pollard and Dixon and D.W. Griffith, they are deliberately advancing a particular interpretation of the war, right? Again, it's not an accident, as Alan Nolan told us, right? This is about people serving their own needs and circumstances. So now that we've kind of talked generally about what the lost cause is and how it became so entrenched in our society, I wanted to talk about a little case study, an example here of a Confederate monument that exhibits the lost cause. And because my own research focuses on Missouri, I thought we could talk about this monument, the Spirit of the Confederacy, which was located in Forest Park in St. Louis. Was located there. The project to begin construction on this monument began in 1905. So again, if we think back to the graph we saw, that matches perfectly with what we saw there. But the process of building it ultimately took about a decade because it was incredibly controversial. So again, we're living in a flashpoint, again, 2020, 2021. We're living in this flashpoint of controversy over Confederate memorials, but they've actually always been controversial when you go back and look at the records. They start this project in 1905, but again, it takes them about 10 years to get it done because there's lots of pushback from Union veterans in St. Louis who are not happy about this monument. In 1906, one Union veteran called the monument totally inappropriate. Another Union veteran observed, if this monument is to be erected as a monument to the lost cause, I can see no reason for it. I have traveled all over the world and I don't remember to have ever seen a monument erected to causes that have been lost. That was 1906. I think people are saying very similar things today. The committee that wanted to build the monument was very upset by this backlash. So as a concession, they said, okay. Well, we'll change the design of the monument. We won't show a Confederate flag. We won't show a Confederate soldier in arms, right? We're not going to depict a man in uniform holding a gun. We're not going to show somebody actively taking up arms against the United States government on our monument. So this was their sort of effort to palliate these Unionists in St. Louis. And so ultimately, the Union veterans in St. Louis backed down. The monument is built. It's dedicated in 1915. And then something really interesting happens. So the Union veterans had all this back and forth with the Confederate Monument Association about what the statues here would depict. But when the monument was unveiled, they got the first chance to see what was on the back of the monument, which is all of this text here. So this is the inscription on the reverse of the monument. And I'll just give you a couple seconds to read it. So quite the inscription. Does anybody mind, maybe any of our students mind, what do you think of that? What do you see elements of the lost cause that we talked about a few minutes ago there and the inscription? What do you think? Yeah.
Attempting to glorify the actions of the South and and also to attempt to make bright something that was in fact a very dark stain.
Yeah, it's very laudatory. Again, this is very much about glorification of the Confederacy and its motives. Any other thoughts that jump out? Yeah.
I probably support any of the bullet points that you had just on the short rundown of the lost cause with any short little blurb in here.
It's great, right? I mean, when I read this, I was like, wow, this is definitely doing all my work for me. Yeah. It's pretty much like you said, a laundry list. It says, this is about defending the Constitution and the legacy of the American Revolution. We're celebrating the bravery of Confederate soldiers. Let's see overwhelmed by numbers, right? We talked about that a lot. It has a quote by Robert E. Lee. Again, they're celebrating their leaders is particularly heroic. One of the things, though, that historians of memory are always interested in, not just what it says, what does it leave out? So if we think about that bullet point, what's missing from this version of the Confederacy?
Anything that has to do with slavery.
Yes, absolutely. Right, absolutely. No discussion here about the role of slavery in the war. So again, the hope of the people who built this, right, was that future generations, and they're very clear about this, that people would bring their children to this monument. And this is how people would learn about the Civil War. So, conceivably then, this is a whole generation that's not going to learn anything about the association between the Civil War and slavery. But as I said, this monument was always controversial. The Union veterans in St. Louis get a good look at this inscription, and they're very upset. One of them, a man named George Bailey, wrote a long speech in which he accused the monument of perpetuating monumental misrepresentations, which I love. It's a perfect title. He said that the facts reported on the monument were, quote, supremely ridiculous and a joke. He went on to accuse the Monument Association of deliberately withholding this inscription because they knew it was going to make people mad. He said the Confederates could manipulate the facts however they saw fit, but no such monument, quote, could ever redeem the inhuman cause of the slaveholders' rebellion. So again, that was 1915. a serious controversy in St. Louis over this monument. Following the death of Michael Brown and the violence in Ferguson that followed in 2015, St. Louisans again thought about this monument and the place it held in their community and whether or not that the monument should remain. So it became a focus of Black Lives Matter protests in 2015. And then again, after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And so in June of 2017, it was dismantled and relocated to the Missouri Civil War Museum, which is out at Jefferson Barracks. So why has the lost cause proven so pervasive and potent? Well, the reason, as I touched on earlier, is that it belonged to people with power. As we've said a couple times, the end of Reconstruction brought about the redemption of former Confederates. They returned to political offices. They shunted and ignored the Reconstruction amendments. Black Southerners lost the protection of the United States Army. They faced disenfranchisement and segregation. But they were still not quiet in their criticism of the lost cause. In 1877, Frederick Douglass said, "There was a right side and a wrong side in the late war, which no sentiment ought to cause us to forget. And while today we would have malice toward none and charity toward all, it is no part of our duty to confound right with wrong or loyalty with treason." In 1931, W.E.B. Du Bois said the following: "The most terrible thing about war, I am convinced, is its monuments, the awful things we're compelled to build in order to remember the victims. In the South, particularly, human ingenuity has been put to it to explain on its war monuments the Confederacy. Of course, the plain truth of the matter would be an inscription something like this: sacred to the memory of those who fought to perpetuate human slavery. But that reads with increasing difficulty as time goes on. It does, however, seem to be overdoing the matter to read on a North Carolina Confederate monument, 'Died fighting for liberty.'" So there are certainly people criticizing the lost cause, even in the early 20th century, Union veterans, Black activists, but they lacked ultimately the cultural and political authority to counteract the widespread acceptance of the lost cause. It's not really until the civil rights era, and we can maybe go back to our little graph, that we see the first real serious scrutiny of the lost cause taking place, right? So I think it's no accident that we have a little spike here during the civil rights movement, and then it falls off precipitously. This is a moment when the first African-American history programs have been established. They're producing scholars and they're encouraging research into a different perspective on the Civil War, particularly a Black perspective. Their research placed slavery at the heart of the conflict, exposed slavery as a complicated, but ultimately brutal and dehumanizing institution. They also called attention to the contributions of Black Americans to the victory of the United States. Again, because history is shaped by the needs of the present, it's also important to remember that these scholars were working in an environment where the ongoing ramifications of slavery and racism were matters of national news. Segregationists used Confederate symbols during their campaign of massive resistance to civil rights legislation. And again, just as was true in the immediate aftermath of the war, the way they're using the lost cause exposed the reality that their language about defending states' rights from outside agitators or from federal intervention was very much loaded with white supremacy, right? They're not vague about this, right? States' rights, racial integrity. So I think what's important to know then is that, again, Confederate monuments in particular, right? These are not objective representations of history. These represent deliberate choices These monuments were erected in order to stamp out the states of the former Confederacy, to mark it as a society that revered the Confederacy, condoned lynching, propped up segregation, disenfranchised Black voters, silenced opposition, all because it believed white supremacy was more important than justice. And so for generations, Black Americans have been leading the campaign to dismantle the lost cause and white supremacy. And the Black Lives Matter movement has generated some important success here. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, more than 150 Confederate memorials have been moved or dismantled since 2015, but there are still hundreds. Okay, so just a few thoughts to kind of wrap up this conversation. I'll be very interested in what questions you have. Monuments don't simply represent history, they're expressions of memory, which means they offer interpretations of history, and that's interesting and important in its own right, because monuments powerfully represent the intersection between the past and the present, and how our desire to find meaning in the past can lead to misinterpretation or misrepresentation. Why does Civil War history matter? Because the lost cause version of Civil War history has been used to justify secession, to defend slavery, and to defend segregation, to justify the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. It's been used to terrorize Black Americans, as in the case with D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation. It's been used to argue that they're incapable of citizenship and undeserving of equality of opportunity. In short, it perpetuates white supremacy. So it's extremely important to provide a counter to this narrative. And when you do that, when you provide a counter to that lost cause narrative, you're not tearing down history. You're tearing down the version of history that Jubal Early and Edward Pollard and Thomas Dixon and D.W. Griffith wanted you to believe. But because Civil War history matters so much, it's proven incredibly difficult to ask people to divorce themselves from their personal, political, or regional memories that they have about this conflict. And until we disentangle history from memory, we're going to continue to experience the sort of disruptions that we've seen in the last 2 years. So thank you very much. I've certainly talked long enough. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
I have a question. One thing that just doesn't make sense is how anyone can use an excuse of, oh, we were overwhelmed, therefore we weren't defeated. If you're overwhelmed by a superior football team, then you still lose. Just because the end is inevitable doesn't mean that suddenly you didn't lose. How can you just call that not a loss?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and I like to sort of put the numbers side by side for my classes, right? So let's talk about, let's really talk about manpower and material and how much it mattered in this war. And more historians are arguing that there's never a case, there's never an instance in which the Confederates lost the battle because they lacked supplies. So again, that's one of those aspects of the lost cause narrative that doesn't really ring true.
Well, I was just going to ask, in your opinion, do you think that we will see the dismantling of the lost cause narrative in our lifetimes, or will this be a very long time to come?
It's a really good question, and just strictly as a matter of opinion, I mean, I think we're getting there, but I've been surprised by how much resistance is still mounted towards contextualizing or removing monuments. Again, I think what's important to remember is that this is all very recent history, and the lost cause it's even more recent, and the civil rights movement is even more recent. And so many of the teachings of the lost cause are still so deeply ingrained, for example, in school textbooks. Certainly in my childhood, that's less true now, but there are still places where you can find lost cause arguments like slavery was benign in textbooks that are being used in classrooms today. I think that's going to be the place to really confront and dismantle the lost cause. I don't think bringing down monuments is going to do it. We have to, again, change the narrative of Civil War history that people are taught. And that process is, I think, just sort of beginning to happen. I hope that answers your question. I had an answer and then I sort of went down a different rabbit hole in my, but I think we got there. Yeah, DJ.
As a person who, looking at some of those lost cause things, was definitely taught some of those lost cause things from the area I was in, and heard those things from older figures in the community. Do you think when the older community starts to eventually fade away, do you think these ideas will become less and less, or do you think it's still going to be ingrained as it is now?
That's a good question. I guess I see it fading. I don't think, and that's the other thing that's interesting to me as a historian is that, you know, just understanding that our narratives about the past change and evolve all the time. So we're witnessing this evolution happen. I do think it'll fade out, and it only makes sense that it would, because that's just the way this process unfolds, right? Historians follow trends and narratives of history, and you know, we're interested in the moments at which they rise to prominence and fade away. That this process of revision and rewriting the narrative of history, that's always happening. And what's always sort of interesting to me is that, you know, people don't understand that that's part and parcel of history. History is not set in stone. It's not immutable. Historians are always revising it as new information becomes available, as they can add new and diverse perspectives. And we would expect that of any other discipline, right? You're going to update your software on your computer. Well, let's update our historical narratives too. That's just what happens. And so I think it's only natural and would only make sense that this turning of a generation, there'll be a turn of the narrative.
Do you think like the lost cause mentality like still exists today at its original meaning, or do you think it's being like kind of warped and changed by like Confederate sympathizers to just perpetuate things like racism and white supremacy?
That's a really great question. I think you're really onto something there. I don't do enough research in the 20th century to really answer your question in the way that it deserves. But I think certainly the lost cause of today cannot be separated from the civil rights era and from the rise of populist, sort of right-wing conservative populist movements in the United States. So the lost cause has taken on elements of those, what do I want to say, positions. So there's this original kernel that's sort of established by Civil War veterans, but definitely it's evolved. And I don't think that lost cause defenders of today could, right, we couldn't say that they were more authentically responding to the Civil War. They're probably much more authentically responding to, again, post-civil rights era populists. I mean, this unite the right image, right? Oops. You know, people have pointed out the elements of right-wing populism or neo-Nazi symbols that were present and visible on that night in Charlottesville. So I hope that
movies like Birth of a Nation and even Gone with the Wind have been, like, until recent years, like widely considered some of the best films in all of history. Do you think they've been considered one of the best films until recent years because of the same reasons that we still have these statues and other kind of things monumenting that?
Yeah, I think so. I think more so for Gone with the Wind than Birth of a Nation. For one thing, Birth of a Nation is like, it's at least 4 hours long. I can't remember now. It's super, super long and it's silent. So there's a real, I think, dissonance when you see Birth of a Nation, but Gone with the Wind is still very effective and moving, beautifully shot Technicolor. The performances are amazing, right? There are lots of things to respond to in that film that the sort of message gets snuck along with the things that are emotional and sympathetic about the characters in the movie. And that's one of the things though that I like to point out about the Lost Cause is that, we could go through that list and debunk things. But one of the things we can't debunk is the idea that it was a tragedy. And I may not sympathize with the loss that former Confederates experienced in that war, but I can empathize with it, if that makes sense, right? I don't have to believe that they were right in order to understand that they suffered. And I think Gone with the Wind, by really concentrating on that aspect of the conflict, the suffering of these people, it is moving, and it is a way in which, the Lost Cause, as much as it has things that we can sort of, easily dismiss out of hand, I think that at the heart, this is about loss. It's the lost cause. It's about the loss that these people experience, how they're trying to justify that loss. And in some ways, that can be very empathetic and it's something that we can easily relate to, even if the larger message is deeply problematic. Got a couple more minutes, enough time for these ones.
If you thought about how sort of the contemporaneous construction of reality will ultimately affect how history remembers things. I teach at the University of Missouri, and that fall of 2015 and all these things are happening. Recently, someone was taking some folks who were visiting campus on a tour, and the people on the tour said, "Wow, you guys have been able to rebuild after the riot."
No.
And it was like, what are you talking about? There weren't any riot, nothing ever burned. I mean, what? That just, someone thinks that 5 years ago, our campus was destroyed and has since been rebuilt. How does that, how will this goofy picture of these guys in those shirts be incorporated into history 20 years from now?
It's really a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. This is the problem, right? That the reality gets divorced from context, and then people fill in those gaps with what makes sense to them. And so this rumor or whatever that the news somehow been demolished surfaces, and maybe it gains traction and maybe it doesn't. I guess again, what it all comes down to is power. Again, whoever is able to promulgate their version of this rights history most effectively, ultimately that's the memory of that event that will win out. So the fringe person, probably their memory is not going to stick around. Oh shoot, I was going to say something else that slipped my brain now, but yeah, it's wild to see the process unfolding. And I guess maybe the last thing too, I thought your question was going to sort of ask how our sort of reality, our understanding of the world is moving digitally.
Right.
So
So we have proof of what really did happen.
Right.
Or do we?
Well, that memory is alive and well in the digital world. There's been a really great book recently by a journalist at the University of Virginia in Richmond who talked about the digital lost cause and how memes have become the monuments of the 21st century. So it's not going away. It's going to change. The story's going to evolve. It's going to take on new elements as the political context changes, but it's very much still something we have to contend with.
It seems to me that history and legends are two separate things. Legends are not really history, and they're in fact are the bane of historians' existence. And I think there's a thread that runs through the history of the Civil War that is about legends, and it appeals to people who have an interest in it, but it also perhaps appeals to people with a certain proclivity to support conspiracy theories and QAnon and various other things. And I think this is where when had the quote that history is about the social construction, which is, I think, true, but I think for a historian, it's an accumulation of stuff viewed sometimes through the prism of the present, but it is still adheres to some degree of reality.
Yeah.
The
Right.
other views don't.
Right. And this is something that I always talk to my graduate students about too, that one of the distinctions, right, at the start of the talk, I was trying to draw a distinction between history as a discipline and something that you pursue because you enjoy it. Well, there's a rigor associated with our discipline that includes peer review and vetting and, accumulation of evidence, as you said, Dr. Goodfellow, that you're not allowed to promulgate, as a professional historian, you can't promulgate a version of history that just appeals to you. You have to have evidence, it has to be substantiated, and your peers have to agree that it's valid. But yeah, there's certainly ways in which, historians are informed by their context, but their expectation is that they're providing a much more authentic narrative. I hope that sort of.
Legends are more satisfying.
Yes.
That's the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Nolan writes a lot about that with the case of Robert E. Lee, that he's the American Odysseus, right? He's become this hero figure that people latch on to because he resonates with that sort of need in humanity for heroes and for stories. I hate to be that person because I think we could keep going for a long time, but we're at the official end of our hour. So if we could give Dr. Fluker another round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.